Hello, everybody. Welcome to Cinema Mancuso, and this is Notes on the News. I'm Peter Mancuso, and this is the show where I break down the biggest stories in film, entertainment, and media, and give you my thoughts. This is actually our inaugural show, the first time we're ever doing this. Super excited. So please forgive me if there are any technical issues or we're kind of moving slowly at all. I've actually been rehearsing this and, been doing like fake streams for the past month or so every week. So I should have ironed out any kind of, foreseeable issues, but just keep that in mind. I'm not sure what kind of live viewership we have, if any, but if you are here watching live, welcome. You're part of history. You get to be here at the very first Notes on the News. And, if at any point in the show you have any questions that you want me to answer or specific things you want me to cover as we move through the different topics, just drop them in the chat. I'll do my best. I don't have a moderator, but I'll do my best to try to keep an eye on that chat to see what people are saying, if anything. But yeah, super happy if you're here live. Happy that you're joining me here. If you're not watching this live, we stream this starting today. We stream this every Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern. So if you want to make sure that you never miss a live stream going forward, don't forget to, as they say, smash that subscribe button, right? All right, so why don't we move into our first topic? Okay, so let's take a look at the box office. This is how I'm going to start the show every week. Kind of just doing a quick overview of the past weekend's box office, just to kind of see where the industry is. I'm not the first person to say this, but obviously, financial success and critical acclaim or just inherent quality are not necessarily correlated, but this at least gives us a sense of what audiences are interested in seeing. So I believe this is the fifth weekend of the year, coming in at a total of 60 million domestic. So actually about a 10% jump from the previous weekend, which was like abysmal. And January is typically a pretty slow time in the American box office, but this year has been particularly slow. A combination of the twin strikes that happened this summer, so there's not as much content to push out, and then what is coming out, people aren't really super excited or super into. So in terms of stuff opening this weekend, we had Argyle coming in at number one, raking at about 18 million domestic, which is a little bit of an underperformance because it was projected to come in around 20 to 30 million, which itself was already kind of a very modest projection, considering what a big budget blockbuster like this would normally bring in. And this was made for reportedly a $200 million budget. So this is, let's see if it has legs, if it kind of holds at a decent amount next weekend and the weekend after that, it could end up, it really depends on if audiences like it, but the critical reaction has not been stellar. So, I am dubious, and I'm predicting that when we talk about this next week, that this is going to have a substantial drop. And it's, in addition to its 18 million domestic gross, it also has grossed about 35 million worldwide. So again, nowhere close to even hitting that budget benchmark. And that isn't even including advertising and marketing costs, which this had a fairly large marketing campaign, I feel like, because the meme was this trailer was everywhere, right? Every time I went to the movies, which I do a lot, I watched this trailer. So it's gonna be interesting to see how this film develops, but it kind of feels like it's gonna be forgotten fairly quickly. And another kind of commentary on just the state of the American film industry in general, coupled with just a January, the landscape of how January usually is. Number two is The Chosen. So if you don't know what The Chosen is a television show about Jesus, right? And it's a multi-season show. And it started off as a crowdfunded thing and then really blew up with people. It's been very, I don't know what the term would be, ecumenical, like people of all different Christian denominations are really into it. It's been very successful. And I believe this is Fathom. I could be wrong. Fathom does a lot of religious-based programming in theaters around the country. But it looks like number two is The Chosen. So they basically screened the first 3 episodes of season 4, coming in at 6 million. I don't know if this is a testament to the popularity of The Chosen or just the dire state of the box office at this point, again, in January, but also just in 2024 at this moment in history. Probably both, right? I think the show is fairly popular with the people who do watch it. But I think it's a real condemnation, or what would a better word be? Just indication of just the glut that you can kind of see in spots 3 to 10, right? So in terms of films that have already been out, that are continuing their run, just a couple notable things here. We got Wonka at number 4. This movie really is the little engine that could. Before this came out, I really predicted that this would be a huge bomb, critically and commercially. And critically ended up doing okay. I still have not seen it, but critically ended up doing okay. And commercially, it's been a tour de force, right? So it's dropped from 3rd to 4th place in its 8th frame. It's been out for like 2 months. And it grossed this weekend about $4.8 million at the domestic box office. Only a 16% drop, right? So it's been holding really, really well. I heard someone compare this before this came out, so they were pretty prescient. They compared this to like The Greatest Showman, whereas that movie also kind of like didn't open huge, but just like kept holding and holding for weeks due to good word of mouth and a lack of any kind of comparable content in the theaters at the time. Kind of a family, Christmassy, blockbustery musical. That person was completely right. I'm more than happy to admit I was wrong here. It's grossed about $201 million domestically so far, and $572 million worldwide. So over $500 million this movie has earned. So it's very surprising. Another movie that was very surprising in terms of its success is Anyone But You, coming in at number 7. Only grossing about $3.5 million this weekend. It dropped from 5th to 7th place, but it's also in its 7th frame. So like Wonka, it's been out for a good amount of time. Only dropped about 24%. And again, this particular weekend's take isn't particularly like fantastic. Again, only $3.5 million. But when you look at these domestic total numbers, it's grossed about $76 million domestically. And not only that, it's then grossed worldwide about $152 million, right? This and I've seen it. I've reviewed it. You can check it out at cinmancuso.substack.com. A good little plug there. It's a fine movie. It's okay. It's a pretty generic rom-com, really bolstered just by the fact that its 2 leads, particularly Sydney Sweeney, are just like some of the most beautiful people working in the industry. And people, I guess, want to see beautiful people fall in love, right? So, I think this definitely gives studios maybe some hope to return potentially to this genre, which I'm sure will just result in a bunch of really shitty generic rom-coms, and then they'll bomb, and then we'll kind of just go back into this cycle. But the success of this has been pretty impressive. What has not been impressive, or what has been impressive in terms of how unimpressive it is Mean Girls. So it's coming in at number 6 at $4 million. It dropped from 1st to 6th place in its 4th frame. If you had been following this, it had pretty substantial drops every weekend, and this is no exception, coming in around 42%. And it's only grossed about $66 million domestically and $93 million worldwide. So again, not awful, but I think people really hoping this would be like a pretty, considering the popularity of the original film, right? But I think people who don't like musicals don't want to see this, and the people who are into musicals think it's a kind of a shitty adaptation of the stage musical, which I have not seen, but I have listened to some of it, and I was a little underwhelmed, frankly. But even people who like the Mean Girls musical find this to be a fairly poor adaptation, since a lot of the leads are not necessarily singers or musical theater performers, though Renee Rapp is obviously an exception to that. So it's just really interesting to see, Mean Girls is just kind of one of the bigger disappointments already of the year. Let's see. Couple other notable things here. We have American Fiction coming in at number 8, grossing about $2.3 million. So it actually jumped up a place. It was at 9th last week, and now is up at 8th in its 8th frame. If you were looking at it last week, it films like that, as well as Poor Things, which also came in the top 10. Those films got like a big bump once the Oscar nominations were announced. And that seems to be obviously still dwindling, but again, only 11% drop. It's grossed about $15 million domestic and worldwide. But again, films like that are not necessarily meant to rake in the big bucks. They really, are for the prestige of the creators as well as the studio that's distributing it. And then just one last note, you have Aquaman, the sequel to the original. You have Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom at number 10, grossing only about 2 million, dropped from 7th to 10th place, about a 26% drop from last weekend. And this film is interesting because it's both a disappointment in that it's not going to come anywhere near what the original Aquaman made, but at the same time, considering the abysmal box office of 2023, in terms of like most big budget superhero films, this is actually done like okay. So it's made about 121 million domestic and 423 million worldwide. So I think it's just an indictment of the industry that a film that makes $423 million worldwide is considered a disappointment, right? That Hollywood's, their eyes were bigger than their stomachs, and their ambitions and their goals were just far too... greedy is the wrong word, but I think just unrealistic that they could sustain a system like this where films are either $1 million or $100 million in terms of their budget, and no mid-budget projects in between. So yeah, that's kind of a basic rundown of the box office for this week. So why don't we move on to story number 1, if I could find it. Okay, perfect. So first story I want to talk about today, UMG removes its music from TikTok. So UMG, Universal Music Group, it's one of the 3 major music labels in the United States. And they announced on Tuesday in an open letter that it was going to pull all of its music from TikTok. This open letter, very, very, I don't want to use the word sassy, but very pointed. Like, it was very scathing. And its title was, quote, "Why We Must Call Timeout on TikTok," end quote. And they basically cited 3 key issues. It kind of feels like the Declaration of Independence, where it's like, we list these reasons as to why, we're doing this. So the first kind of major reason is issues of royalties, right? Which is the most obvious. So according to the Wrap, UMG claims that they only get, quote, a fraction of the rate that similarly situated major social platforms pay, end quote, saying that they only make about 1% of their total revenue from TikTok. So they're looking for better revenue sharing agreements that TikTok, I guess, is not willing to budge on. Another issue that UMG cites is AI, right? The use of artificial intelligence. UMG accuses TikTok here of, quote, allowing the platform to be flooded with AI-generated recordings, end quote. And not only is it flooded, but it's like a self-fulfilling system where people see this AI-generated content and then want to make their own. Right, and it just kind of fuels this never-ending, this proliferation of interest and access in such recordings. I think TikTok even has like a filter or a function where you can create, like covers of songs. It's your voice, but it's right. And UMG calls, this kind of open proliferation of these kinds of this kind of content. UMG calls this, quote, nothing short of sponsoring artist replacement by AI, end quote. So, they want to obviously protect the brand and the sanctity of like having actual musical artists. So that's another issue that they cite. And then the third and last issue that they cite is online safety for users, right? So this isn't even touching on the musician specifically, but just in the general sense of our music is going to be on a platform where there's hate speech and bullying and abuse and all this stuff, and TikTok, according to them, has really offered no meaningful solutions, end quote. I can't remember if this is from the actual open letter or if someone else had made this comment, but someone compared to like whack-a-mole, right? And that's a lot of the social media strategy, these social media company strategies dealing with, content that they don't want on their platforms is basically just it's like you for every person that you remove, 5 more people pop up in their place, right? And UMG basically they claim that they tried to resolve these issues with TikTok. So this is not just coming out of nowhere, right? And they said that concerns were met, quote, first with indifference and then with intimidation, end quote. Furthermore, they wrote, here's like a little passage from the open letter. They said, quote, TikTok attempted to bully us into accepting a deal worth less than the previous deal, far less than fair market value, and not reflective of their exponential growth by selectively removing the music of certain of our developing artists while keeping on the platform our audience-driving global stars, end quote. So it seems like, according to UMG, TikTok, basically tried to strong-arm them, being like, okay, like we're going to basically we'll take off some of your artists and we'll just keep the ones that make us a bunch of money, right? So in this open letter, UMG threatens to pull all of their stuff off of TikTok by January 31st, which, if you've noticed, was last week, right? So, for a couple days, this was like, are they playing chicken? Like, what's going to happen? Nothing ended up happening in terms of a deal. And they basically made good on their threat on February 1st. Videos featuring songs under UMG were either removed or muted. And if you were to go on now and try to use one of these songs, I think if you search the song, it'll say like removed or unavailable due to copyright, right? So who's covered by UMG, right? So like, what is this going to affect? So again, because we live in the United States and everything is a monopoly and capitalism's awful. Yes, I said it. That UMG covers a lot of people. And I have a little select list here, and this is, including but not limited to. So people that are covered by UMG include Taylor Swift. I think we could just stop there. Considering that Taylor Swift is probably the biggest star alive today. Last night, I think she just won her 4th album of the year at the Grammys and like has set the record for that amount. So that's obviously a big loss. Other people include but are not limited to Drake, Olivia Rodrigo, Kendrick Lamar, Billie Eilish, Ariana Grande, Adele, Harry Styles, The Weeknd, Bob Dylan, Justin Bieber, Coldplay, Elton John, Sting, SZA, U2, Post Malone, BTS, Ice Spice, Nicki Minaj, Bad Bunny, Rosalia, Lady Gaga, Rihanna, Alicia Keys, Pearl Jam, and The Beatles. A very notable group of music that is no longer available on TikTok. And a notable one is you also have a song that's been removed now of Sophie Ellis-Bextor's 2001 hit "Murder on the Dance Floor." And the Independent notes that, this is one of the most popular songs on TikTok right now thanks to its use at the end of Saltburn very effectively. So what does TikTok have to say about this? TikTok kind of wrote a counter open letter, or at least it made a public statement saying, quote, I have a little kind of blurb here. Quote, it's sad and disappointing that Universal Music Group has put their own greed above the interests of their artists and songwriters. Despite Universal's false narrative and rhetoric, the fact is that they have chosen to walk away from the powerful support of a platform with well over 1 billion users that serves as a free promotional and discovery vehicle for their talent. TikTok has been able to reach artist-first agreements with every other label and publisher. Clearly, Universal's self-serving actions, it's very scathing, this war of words. Clearly, Universal's self-serving actions are not in the best interests of artists, songwriters, or fans, end quote. So, on one hand, like, I'm not trying to both sides this, but I see both sides, right? And ultimately, I can only care so much because these are two giant, media conglomerates, multinational companies fighting, right? And at some point I can't really care, right? But let's kind of see. So like, what do both stand to lose here, right? So TikTok, this is a big loss for TikTok if this ends up becoming permanent, which I'm sure it won't be. But TikTok has really diversified, but at its core, TikTok is a music sharing company, right? Has lots of content. Including this video, if you're watching this on TikTok, because I plan on breaking them all up, and putting them on TikTok. But, if you remember, this TikTok originally started as a different app called Musical.ly, right? Musical.ly, where people could record them lip syncing to songs and stuff. And, eventually I think that got bought out and kind of got transformed into what TikTok now is, right? And it's just been an integral part of its success from the beginning. And even today, even if it's not music, the use of audio is crucial, right? People using samples and like lip syncing to funny quotes from movies or commercials or just from pop culture. And music, again, is a huge part of that. So, TikTok really stands to lose a big, just both money, but also just the image of, okay, well, I'm going to be limited in terms of what, creators are limited in terms of what content they can use and remix and, what they can do to entertain their fans, right? But on the flip side, here's what UMG has to lose is that TikTok's really important for marketing your music, especially for, up-and-coming musical artists, right? People get discovered. I could be mistaken. I feel like Lil Nas X was kind of, Old Town Road and all of that. Like, I think TikTok played a huge role in that. And then also old songs get new life, right? So we mentioned that song from Saltburn. I think, what was it? Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush. Like, I know that was used in Stranger Things, but people were, using that very much, very excessively on TikTok around that time. You know, and that equals revenue for those labels and those artists, right? At the end of the day, this is ultimately a bargaining tactic, right? You know, it's the open letter format gives the public the chance to get angry about it, right? And I think UMG is hoping to shame TikTok into settling on better terms, right? This is not unprecedented. You know, something similar happened, according to the New York Times. They note that, you know, something like this happened back in 2008. You know, Warner Music Group and YouTube had this like 9-month stare down, essentially, over the copyright of their music being all over their website. And then ultimately it got resolved because they agreed to share in the ad revenue. Whereas this situation, they are already sharing in revenue, but not at a level that UMG feels is appropriate. And reactions are mixed, right? So some songwriters think it's time for a change, you know, and that UMG is holding TikTok accountable, and fighting for them. But then others think that UMG is really only doing this for themselves. And I think that is true, but songwriters will benefit by UMG being self-interested because in this case, you know, their interests are aligned, right? And, you know, aside from just the songwriters and the labels, again, TikTok users, you know, are going to be affected. You know, people who, this is their bread and butter, utilizing popular music. I think the New York Times noted a user, John Casterlin, has had about 10% of his videos muted, right? So that's, if this is like your source of income or one of your sources of income, that's a huge dip, right? That's a huge impact financially. So we'll definitely be keeping an eye on this story, but, you know, it's going to be interesting to see what terms eventually end up getting settled, because they will absolutely settle in some capacity. It's just a matter of when and what those terms will be. Okay, why don't we move on to story number 2? Okay, so Byron Allen, who you can see pictured here, media mogul, former comic, has made a $14.3 billion offer to buy all outstanding shares of Paramount Global. He's offering $28.58 a voting share and $21.53 for all the non-voting shares, essentially offering a 50% premium. And this is really, really big. If you've been following the news, Paramount has been on the market for a little bit, and Allen Media Group wants to buy Paramount and add it to its portfolio of media content and companies, right? So currently AMG, Allen's group, currently owns the Weather Channel, notably, as well as local TV stations, the Grio, maybe it's a publication geared towards like the African American community, as well as some syndicated TV businesses. So, you know, it's clear that Allen is trying to aggressively grow and expand, and he is known for his aggressive negotiating tactics, right? Now, this is not the first time that Allen has tried to acquire other media companies. This offer, specifically as it pertains to Paramount, this offer follows Allen's failed attempt to buy BET and VH1, I think it was last year, for about $3.5 billion. And he also offered publicly $10 billion to buy ABC and other linear assets from the Walt Disney Company. And these were failed offers, but basically they ended up not happening because the sellers got cold feet. And in the case of Disney never was necessarily putting ABC and those linear assets on the market. But, so it's not like they went with someone else besides Byron Allen, right? They just ended up not selling, right? So this, as opposed to those, the Paramount is more or less on the market, right? And AMG is not the only potential buyer. So leading up to this, there had been talks of potentially Skydance, which is a production company, as well as Redbird Capital, them wanting to buy out Sherry Redstone's stake in National Amusement. National Amusements is the company that owns Paramount, and Sherry Redstone and the Redstone family own a controlling interest of National Amusements, so there's talk of potentially buying Redstone out. And there's also, earlier this year, talk of a potential merger with Warner Brothers Discovery. And according to Deadline, CEO of Paramount, Bob Bakish, said in a town hall and in a memo last week that they would look at all options. So clearly it's on the market, which really helps Allen's chances here, unlike those other situations. So what would Allen reportedly do with Paramount? So according to Deadline, from one of their sources, it seems like his goal would be to essentially sell the fat and keep what's important to him. So he would basically want to sell the studio, sell some of its real estate, like production facilities and stuff like that, as well as some IP. Keeping the best stuff, but probably selling off what is not. It's kind of weighing the company down. And then he would really want to try to keep the linear networks and the streaming service, particularly the latter. And it seems like his intention is to try to run it more cost effectively. So what do the markets think of this, right? This would be a huge media merger, M&A story, right? So Paramount stock actually went up after the announcement. It rose about 8% in early by the end of Wednesday last week. And the stock market is not always right, but ultimately the stock market is in the business of predicting things, right? So that shows a sense of confidence among the Wall Street elite that this could go through. Both legally, but then also just the fact that would Paramount even agree to such a sale? We have, according to Deadline, we have KeyBank Capital analyst Brendan Dispo urging the company to, quote, immediately take this deal, end quote, calling out the all-cash form of the bid as especially appealing. Technically, this is like a $30 billion offer because I think they're also, in addition to like the 14 or 15 billion in cash, essentially, I believe Allen is willing to take on about $15 billion of basically take on all of their debt, which is also about $15 billion. So it's ultimately going to cost Allen Media Group about $30 billion for this deal. But again, like I said, he clearly wants to aggressively grow. He clearly wants to be a major media mogul in the industry. So going forward, it's Deadline reports that Paramount is going to set up a special committee to evaluate any potential offers. And notably, this committee would exclude Sherry Redstone, right? And a source that Deadline spoke to said that, quote, it does look like the idea is to sell the whole company instead of just Sherry selling her stake, end quote, right? So it's not, they don't necessarily, Allen doesn't seem to really want to get National Amusements, and then by extension Paramount, he really just wants to go for the jugular, so to speak, right? Overall though, my opinion on this, like, on the whole, just more M&A is just not going to be good for the industry, right? Which is already consolidating between Warner Brothers Discovery and Disney and Fox 5 or however many years ago. So I think it just hurts the industry. There's going to be less diversity. Jobs will be lost. But if you're just a business person, I think Paramount probably needs a shakeup, right? It has not been performing particularly well, even considering COVID, right? Like, no one has been performing as well as they used to necessarily. But even in that context, Paramount has been kind of falling behind. So maybe it needs a shakeup like this, and kind of someone who can come in and trim the fat and really make it, make it relevant again, the way that Disney and Universal and Warner Brothers are, right? So with that, why don't we move on to story number 3? Okay, so this is kind of a smaller story, but I thought this was kind of interesting here. So it's reported that Amazon has spent $2 billion more in 2023 on TV shows and movies and music compared to last year. So last year they spent about $16.6 billion, and this year they spent about $18.9 billion. So that's a 14% increase. What were these costs associated with? So primarily with licensing, which was probably aided by the fact that studios, I can't prove this wasn't reported, but I would imagine the fact, I don't know if you've noticed, but like Warner Brothers and other studios have been putting their stuff on other streaming services. So think Disney, I think, is putting some of their stuff on Netflix, right? I would imagine that decision was informed by just a general malaise of the industry and the kind of shattered dreams of the streaming business. But then also the twin strikes from last year. So there's not as much content, so they need to find alternative revenue streams. So the fact of that, I think is what has now lended itself to Amazon spending more on licensing. And they've also, some of that, 18.9 billion is also just part of their production costs, right? And that's from Variety. But then we also have from Variety, the CEO of Amazon, Andy Jassy, believing that Prime Video is on its way to being a very sizable and profitable business in its own right, which is going to be interesting, especially if the government forces Amazon to break up all of its assets. Prime Video could stand on its own. But, it recently also, Amazon just introduced ad-supported content, even if you're like a paying subscriber. And that's going to be additional revenue, right? So, with that additional, cash flow, it's clear that Amazon now has more cash to invest in Prime Video and really make it not only a staple of a Prime membership, but just one of the major players in the streaming business, right? And again, this shows an interest in growing the service, whereas other streamers are really trying to tighten the belt here. Once Netflix had its kind of tumble, I can't remember when that was, if it was 2022 or maybe really early 2023, but once Netflix kind of tumbled and had a decrease in subscribers for the first time ever, every company that had a streaming service, their stocks dropped, and they were like, okay, we need to start, like Byron Allen seems to want to do with Paramount Plus. So trim the fat. Okay, this we don't, if we're licensing this, we don't need to. This show, it's not really getting a lot of viewers, so we're just gonna delete it. And there's no physical copies, but no one who gives a shit, according to them. But this kind of shows everyone's zigging and Amazon's zagging, right? And I think Amazon has a really, I think they have a real opportunity here that they've already been doing, and I think they really need to double down on this, and that is, it really needs to become an entertainment hub, right? Their original content and everything is really important, but if you also, you also know that Prime Video is like their subscription service, but then there's also a vast library of film and TV content too, and music, but I'm just focusing here on Prime Video. A whole vast library of content to rent and buy digitally. And that does not, and usually that is not, a select amount of things that are agreed to be licensed. Like, essentially, this is everything you could ever want to rent or buy. What Amazon really needs to do and has been doing is become that entertainment hub where, currently you can get a subscription to certain streaming services, but watch them through Amazon Prime. I'm not sure how the financials work for that. Like, how much, is the subscription more expensive on Prime versus if you just like downloaded that specific streaming service? How does Prime and that other third party, how do they split up that revenue? Because ultimately Prime is hosting the service in a way. So they've already been doing that. I think they really need to lean into that as people get, more and more people get more and more fed up with the fact that there are like 10 different streaming services, and you have to remember all your passwords for all of them, and stuff is moving around all the time. And it's basically just turning into cable. So I think Amazon, and I think Apple also has this opportunity because they similarly have that vast library of content to rent or buy, becoming a place where people can use their other streaming services. You can also get like sports and live TV, which again, they're already kind of doing, but they really need to lean into that. If I was their marketing manager, that's what I would really stress, is I think that's how you need to pitch this to people, that this is basically can be your one-stop shop for all of your, everything you could ever want to watch, right? And though that being said, though, they've been spending all this money last year, but at the same time, they just did a huge amount of layoffs, of hundreds of employees last month across, again, these content verticals, right? So at MGM, at Prime Video, at Twitch, at Audible. So, they're clearly putting money into it, but is that money always going to places that help the average worker? Probably not. But, again, I really do feel like they have this opportunity to really elevate Prime Video. I feel like it's, it was really the primary competitor to Netflix, I feel like, for a long time, and then Hulu, and then, all these other ones eventually came. And because of all these other players now, I feel like Prime has really kind of been downgraded. It's kind of like a B level of streaming service, probably because it doesn't have an incredible originals lineup. It has some hits, but nothing huge, or at least not in the in terms of like the volume. This could be the way they kind of, really plant their flag in the sand, so to speak. All right. So why don't we then move on, if I can pull up OBS, to story number 4. Okay, so big news. So Spotify, Variety notes that Spotify has now inked a new multi-year partnership deal with Joe Rogan for his podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience. Maybe I should have named this the Peter Mancuso Experience. So the deal is reportedly worth up to $250 million. Spotify will handle distribution and ad sales, and Rogan will receive a guaranteed minimum fee along with a cut of the advertising revenue. The big kind of thing here, though, is that the podcast will no longer be exclusive to Spotify. This will be the first time in 3 years, right? So about 3 years ago, they signed the original deal, which was worth about $100 to $200 million for 3.5 years, according to Verge. And Joe Rogan, the only place you could listen to Joe Rogan was on Spotify, right? And this change, kind of reflects Spotify's new broader strategy that they started last year in 2023. Variety notes that, this would include ditching exclusivity for broader distribution across, Apple Podcasts and, my preferred podcast listening app is Pocket Casts. The idea would be to get it out there more and then use that ad revenue to increase, the overall kind of profit of the enterprise, which I think is a very smart move. I'm not sure if the Joe Rogan Experience currently has ads on it, but you could still make the Spotify version of the show like a premium version, or you could have it air there first and then a few days later it goes to Apple Podcasts or whatever. So I really do think that this is this is a smart move on Spotify to kind of move away from exclusivity. They're doing the same thing for their another really popular podcast on their platform, Call Her Daddy. So, this kind of, again, represents a larger, broader strategy that Spotify is employing. But if you remember, Joe Rogan is a very controversial figure. So I'm sure there's plenty of people who are not happy with this decision to renew this plan. He has come under fire for, particularly COVID misinformation, along with some, problematic content about, being some anti-Semitism, some use of slurs, and some generally just off-color remarks. And if you remember, there was that huge boycott from musicians in 2022. People like Joni Mitchell and who was it, Neil Young, pulling their, and amongst many others, pulling their music off of Spotify in an attempt to try to get them to do something about Joe Rogan, particularly when it came to COVID misinformation. And it didn't really seem to work. It got people like me, just because I love Joni Mitchell. I ended up, and for a couple other reasons, I didn't like the way the Spotify app, its functionality all the time didn't necessarily meet my needs anymore. I since moved to Apple Music, which I'm much happier with. But clearly not enough people did that for Spotify to do anything. So not only did they not let him go, they've recommitted now to him. And I'm conflicted about Joe Rogan because ultimately, all of those issues are very valid because he is a huge figure in the podcasting scene. Millions and millions of people listen to him. So when he has people on in the interest of just like hearing different perspectives, and it's someone talking about spreading COVID misinformation about the vaccines, that can be very dangerous. Along with all of the other, off-color comments and racist remarks, or that's all valid, right? But despite these issues, I have not listened to Joe Rogan Experience, but it seems like a very interesting show. Not so much for Rogan, but for the guests, right? So, you'll get those guests, again, that are problematic for whatever reason, but then you'll have some really interesting people on there, right? And my favorite is, because the TikTok algorithm is very mysterious and knows exactly what I want to see. I just see Neil deGrasse Tyson videos on TikTok all the time. Also, potentially a problematic person. I think he was accused of sexual assault or harassment or something, but I don't know if that ever went anywhere. But I just find him, in terms of like what he talks about, very interesting. And I often see excerpts of his appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience. So I would imagine that Rogan's show is best when he kind of gets out of the way and let the guests be interesting, right? And he's been very interesting for a lot of people, right? So this is a huge, this deal, going back a few years now, this partnership or relationship has been a huge success for Spotify, right? THR notes that this is, it's been their top podcast of the year 4 years in a row. And it's also just, Joe Rogan is important for podcast, like the history of podcasting, fortunately or unfortunately. Again, because he's just helped drive general podcast listening on the platform and in general. The Guardian notes that, in that 4-year period that I just mentioned, podcast listening rose by 232% in that time period. So, ultimately, podcasting is huge. It's a great revenue stream because it's fairly low effort. Not saying that it doesn't take a lot of work, but it's very cost low. Like it's people talking, right? The cost is in the labor. So it's a really great enterprise. Just recently, that podcast Smart Less, with who is it? Sean Hayes, Will Arnett, and Jason Bateman. That was like a pandemic show that really blew up. And then I think it was on Amazon's podcast platform, Wondery, right, if I'm correct. But now it's going to SiriusXM in a huge multi-million-dollar deal. So podcasting is huge right now. I feel like 5 years ago I would have said podcasting is huge, but it's even huger, and it's only going to get huger. It's only going to keep going. Okay. Why don't we then move on to, if I can find OBS, I apologize. Story number 5. Okay, so if you don't know who this is Shane Gillis, who is a stand-up comedian who is going to be hosting SNL at the end of the month. So why is this a big deal? Well, it's because he was originally fired from SNL in 2019. And fired's almost is like an overstatement because they never even started. He was announced as an upcoming cast member. But then before like the season even started, some not so great jokes resurfaced of his, homophobic and racist jokes, particularly with, like the racist jokes like using Chinese slurs and racist references to like Chinatown, among other things. So ultimately SNL parted ways with him. It's an example of cancel culture, which I have mixed feelings about, but typically I'm on the side of, in the sense of, like if you're going to say this stuff very publicly, it's one thing to have said something privately to someone decades ago and you didn't know better and now you do know better and you regret saying that stuff, but that's one thing. But this is like, this were things he said like on a podcast, like not that long before, right? And, it ultimately, he ended up getting booted from that cast list, right? But since then, he's become very popular. He's probably better off having not been on SNL. I personally, I see his stuff on TikTok all the time. And I forgot that this was the guy. Like, I remembered someone getting fired from SNL because of something like this. I forgot it was him. So I've been seeing his stuff on TikTok for months now, and I find from what I've seen, he's very funny, insightful. He has like a good kind of identity about him. Like he feels very, he doesn't feel like he's a hack in a sense. He has a really funny one about like Jackie Robinson, and how, like white people used to talk really cool, and then they saw him go up to bat for the first time and they just like completely lost all their cool cred, which is, I think is pretty funny, right? In I think it was like 2021, he had his stand-up special debut, which is like a YouTube upload, and it now has 16 million views, right? And his recent special was with Netflix, right? According to Uprocks, right? And also according to Rolling Stone, it's important, since he got fired from SNL, he seems to have avoided controversy since, right? I'm gonna totally butcher this name, I apologize, but Khalifa Saneh, a New Yorker author, in a profile that they did, noted that, because he was quote unquote canceled, a lot of times people are canceled, especially when it comes to like racist or homophobic things, like the right, like people on the right like latch onto them as like champions of free speech and this, that, when really they're just being champions of racism and homophobia most of the time. Not to lump everyone in, but I don't know how you hear someone use slurs and then like suddenly like you didn't know anything about them and now you really like them, right? It's like famous people who like will say something transphobic and then conservatives will come out of the woodwork being like, I always liked that guy. But, like, they've been very liberal throughout their entire career up until, like, this one comment. But anyway, so, funny enough, actually tying into our last story here. So, Gillis was on the Joe Rogan Experience in 2021, and he said, quote, I don't want to be a victim, I want to be a comedian, end quote. So it seems like he really tried to just move on from the SNL thing. His statement at the time was fairly gracious, just saying, like, you know, these things happen, you know, I'm just going to move forward. You know, and now he's going to be hosting the show. That's like being asked to be a consultant for your C-suite at a company that you got fired from, right? So, you know, I mean, good for him. Again, a lot of people are going to have mixed feelings about this. You know, it kind of reveals ultimately that cancel culture has had mixed success, right? You know, because you have people that get canceled, and then you have people who get canceled but then kind of find their way back into the industry as if everything is fine now. So, you know, and this is an example of that, I think at least. So, you know, I think if he's earnestly changed and trying to change, I think, okay, great. But, you know, it is very interesting to see kind of his career trajectory. Okay. All right, so this is, we're going to start wrapping up soon, but before we go, we have a couple, just like 1 or 2 more sections here. In terms of upcoming releases, the big thing that's going to be wide coming out this Friday, is Lisa Frankenstein, which, I don't really know a lot about. It seems to kind of be like a modern take on like a Frankenstein kind of story. Like I'm getting Renfield vibes if you saw that film last year. And, you know, I heard I think it's probably going to be fine, but we'll see. But in any case, it, you know, its projections are not super great. It's only projected to make about 7 to 12 million in its opening weekend. So again, not super great. Okay, and something I want to try to do every week is just a little shout out to the best film I watched that week. This could be films that I've seen before, or films I've never seen before, or films I've seen a bajillion times. And this week I want to give a shout out to The Holdovers. I actually watched this for the second time. This week I saw it when it was first came out in theaters in the fall. My fiance and her friend, we try to watch all the Best Picture films every year, and you know, this was one of the films that we decided to watch, and it's just so great. I loved it when I first saw it, but there's just something so, you know, it's just so warm and cozy. And I was worried to watch it in February because it's not quite a Christmas movie, but it's very much about the Christmas season. So I was worried about how it would play watching it in February, and if anything, it was even better. It was really cozy and heartwarming, and you know, I'm very interested to see what kind of success it has at the Academy Awards. All right, so that pretty much does, you know, wraps it up for the show. I just want to give a few quick little plugs if I can. I want to plug a sister YouTube channel of this, a YouTube channel of mine called Peter Squared. It's an opportunity for me to kind of explore more in-depth topics about film, media, and entertainment in a more written form, video essay format. Our current video that we have up is a long 3-hour epic opus, if you will, about the Disney film Frozen, kind of looking at what went right, what went wrong, and everything in between. So link in the description. It would be great if you could check that out. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Also want to give a shout out to the podcast me and my fiance Viviana do every week, called Now That's What I Call a Franchise, where each season we pick a film franchise and then we go through each film in that franchise. The good, the bad, and the ugly is what we like to say. Currently we're doing Batman. And I believe we just released our episode on Batman Return of the Caped Crusaders, which is like the Adam West animated sequel to his original 60s show. Again, it would be great if you could check it out, link in description. And then lastly, Cinema and QSO. This is not just a YouTube channel, and this is not just a live stream show. For about 2 years now, I've been writing written reviews of new films that come out. And that's how Cinema and QSO started, as a Substack newsletter, and I still write reviews as much as I can. Link in the description. You can find us at cinemandqso.substack.com. But that's the rest. That's the end of the show. For any viewers that we have, I really appreciate you, you know, taking the time to watch the show. I hope you come back next week. And if you're watching this after the broadcast, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It would really be a big help. And yeah, that's it. I hope you have a good rest of your week, and I'll see you next Monday. Take care, guys.